Hey, Walter Sorrells back with more tips for the knife maker. Today, making a Japanese sushi knife from a piece of antique wrought iron anchor chain. Today's video is sponsored by Combat Abrasives, grinder belts, and other abrasives for the knife maker. CombatAbrasives.com. Now, the Japanese sushi knife, also known as a yanagi or yanagi-ba, is considered to be one of the most demanding cooking knives to make. So I'm going to take a stab at the form, but I'm going to tell you right now, up front, this is not my area of expertise. I'm a Japanese sword guy, not a Japanese knife guy. I did a bunch of research, but at the end of the day, I'm probably going to do some things that would make a sushi chef cringe. Hey, so be it. I'm going to take my lumps, make my mistakes. If that happens and we get some of the nuances wrong, hey, so be it, but we're going to learn from our mistakes. So, what you'll be watching is the process of how I learn. Learn through doing. Big believer in that. If you're afraid to make mistakes, it's very hard to pick up new skills. So let's talk Japanese cutting tools. Unlike conventional Western knives, a sushi knife has a single bevel, which is basically what you would call a chisel grind in Western terminology. Now, the knife itself is operated on a pull stroke, the idea being that each time you cut, you're going to make one single pass through the piece of sushi and get this really nice, clean cut. Unlike Western knives, there's no secondary bevel, so the bevel of the knife comes right smack down to the edge, and this just makes it insanely sharp. So another important point about Japanese knives, and this is true of many Japanese cutting implements, including plane blades and chisels, even Japanese swords, is that they're traditionally made as laminates, meaning that the cutting edge is made from a separate piece of steel, hard steel, that's forge welded to kind of softer backing steels. In this case, we're going to actually use a piece of antique wrought iron, really old iron, which is, kind of how this would have been done traditionally, 100, 150, 200 years ago. What this allows you to do is that you can harden your edge super hard and yet have this more flexible back to it that allows the cutting tool, whether it's a knife or a plane blade or whatever, to flex just a little bit. Bottom line, really hard edge, soft back. Now, the ultimate Western kitchen knife is the chef's knife, which is sort of a do-it-all blade. You can slice, dice, chop, julienne, all these different things. There's really nothing you can't do, but this means that it's not really the perfect knife for much of any single task. The Japanese approach to kitchen cutlery is a little different. The idea is to have a ton of just very specialized knives that do one thing really well. So the sushi knife is kind of a classic example of that. Long, thin, has this super sharp edge. It's very hard, in fact, so hard that it's actually prone to chipping. You would never want to use a knife like this for chopping because you'd be very likely to damage the edge. One thing only. All right, enough talk. Let's jump into it. I'll begin by cutting up this link of antique wrought iron anchor chain. Then I'll take one of these pieces and I'll forge it into a bar. Oops. Right here you see the joy of wrought iron. There was a crappy weld in this link, and so the wrought iron broke in half. Let's try another piece. Now, these days, people use the term wrought iron for just any old piece of iron that's used to make, balustrades and fences and things like that. But that's not true wrought iron. Typically, what's used now is mild steel. True wrought iron was made by a process known as puddling, and the puddling process makes it very different material from modern malleable or mild steel. It contains a lot of silica slag, heterogeneous carbon content, and lots of tiny imperfections. The beauty of wrought iron is that it makes it look really cool. The disadvantage is that depending on the quality of the piece, it may not be very robust material. Nevertheless, all's well that ends well. Eventually we corral some good material and forge it out into a bar. Next, we'll forge weld it to a piece of modern tool steel. This is Hitachi No. 2 blue paper steel. It's a high carbon tool steel with tungsten, making it capable of very high hardness. Now, Western smiths typically tack weld steels together before they forge weld them, but in this case, we've only got two pieces. This isn't a very complicated weld, so we'll just heat up the wrought, sprinkle some borax flux on it, then perch our little piece of blue steel on top. Now, the whole thing is brought to a welding heat, and the weld is gently set with a few taps of the hammer. Back into the fire, then we'll use the hydraulic press to draw it out into a bar. Next step is to form it into the long, slim shape of the sushi knife. There are subtleties to every blade shape, and you often have to take a few whacks at it to feel them intuitively. Now, having never forged this precise shape myself, I kind of undershot it in a couple ways and made it just a hair too slim. Now, I just haven't forged this precise shape before, so I didn't really have a feel for it. So bottom line, it didn't widen quite as much as I anticipated, and we've got a blade that's a little bit slimmer than intended. Something else to be aware of when forging any sort of single beveled blade. It'll corkscrew. There's no way of avoiding this, it's just the physics of the situation. You're expanding metal on only one side of the blade, and the only compensation that it can make is to corkscrew. So you have to do a little counter compensation to flatten it back out. And in this case, I just twisted a little with the tongs, and we're good. Japanese kitchen knife tangs are very slim, and they're entirely enclosed within the handle. Now, they ride pretty high on the knife, so you have to forge them down toward the spine with the hammer driving all your material away from the edge. If you try to go from both directions, you'll end up with something that looks more like a Bowie knife, where the tang is more or less centered in the middle of the knife. That's not the way these things are supposed to be constructed. Alright, once we've got the tang set, then we'll go ahead and taper it. More fun with wrought iron. The iron actually splits on some of these crummy ancient welds, something that would never happen with modern steel. So I have to hot cut some excess and work around the problem. Adjust and overcome, right? The advantages of this material come with some costs. One thing I will say is that it's really fun forging this old iron. It's so much softer and easier to forge than modern steel. Just a real pleasure to use. Except for this little splitting problem. Anyway, once I'm happy with the overall shape, I'll give it what we sometimes call a bladesmith's anneal, leaving it to cool slowly inside the furnace, which will soften the steel a little, making it easier to do the next operations. Now, Japanese smiths typically use humongous wet grinding stones with very large diameters, but I'll use my belt grinder. For the most part, this won't have any effect on anything, but it does have one moderately important implication, which I'll get into later. You'll notice that I'm leaving part of the blade unground. Some Japanese knives keep this sort of rough, as-forged texture, while others grind it smooth or impress it with hammer marks. There's really no right way to do it. This rough look just kind of appeals to me. In this close-up of the blade, you can easily see the banding effect caused by the variations in the wrought iron. This is part of the charm of the material and part of why I used it. It looks sort of like Damascus steel, but it's not. This is just the natural variability of the material. Hey, let me bust in here real quick. Recently, a company called Combat Abrasives has partnered with us to sponsor some videos on this channel, including this one. Now, I've been using Combat's belts on my grinder since early this year, and I've really been impressed with both their quality and the value. Their basic aluminum oxide belts come in at a really good price point, and they last a lot longer than, some of the kind of inexpensive belts that I've used in the past. Another thing I've been really excited about is their ceramic belts, which I use mostly for roughing in the 40, 60, and 120 grit range. Great value. They also carry Hermes flexible belts as well. Family-run company, American-made product, great service. Check out their online shop, combatabrasives.com, by clicking the link in the description. All right, let's get back to work. Once the geometry is where I want it, I'll go ahead and heat treat the blade. The forge is brought to temperature, and then the knife is heat treated to roughly 1500 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm using a magnet to detect the temperature. At about 425 Fahrenheit, steel loses its magnetic properties, so I know that once I get a little bit over that, I'm getting close to my goal. So just let it creep up a little bit and make sure the entire blade is brought to temperature. When it reaches the right temperature, I'll plunge it into a tube full of warm peanut oil. This will convert the austenite to martensite, hardening the blade. A quick file test indicates that it's hardened. Now, of course, the wrought iron is not capable of hardening, so only the blue steel will harden. Then into the tempering oven at 375 for an hour. Now, martensite, despite the fact that it's harder than other forms of steel, is actually less dense, meaning that it expands slightly when the blade hardens. So that's going to cause the blade to warp. This is really pretty much unavoidable in a two-part laminate like this. So, time for some straightening. First, I dished out a piece of scrap fiberboard with a large contact wheel on my grinder. It's just around 1/8 of an inch of depression, maybe a hair more. Then I gently use a mallet to beat the blade straight. If you've ever straightened Western style knives, which verges from difficult to impossible depending on how they were heat treated, this operation is so pleasant and easy. Just tap gently, keep checking patiently, and eventually you'll get everything nice and flat. I'll also adjust the tang. I want to create a shoulder, so I'll use a filing jig to ensure extremely square shoulders, which will mate to the handle without unsightly gaps. I just made a video a couple weeks ago about how this jig was made, so check that out here if you want details. I'm finishing this off with a needle file which has one face ground flat. Having a so-called safe face like this and using this little bitty file together allow me to cut a really nice square corner. After tempering, I'll do some final shaping on the grinder to bring the bevel down closer to a sharp edge. Now, I mentioned that typically Japanese smiths use large diameter stones for grinding. This allows them to slightly hollow out the back of the knife, leaving only a tiny little rim of steel all the way around. This is done on many kinds of Japanese cutting tools, including plane blades and chisels. It makes it much easier to sharpen that rear flat portion, bringing the entire blade back to a high level of sharpness. Now, in order to do this, however, you need extremely large radii on your wheels. Ain't gonna happen on my belt grinder, so I'm just skipping it. It won't hurt the quality of the blade, but it will make it a little more difficult to sharpen. And time for another screw up. In this case, it was just plain old inattention. Now, according to Japanese norms for how these knives are made, the bevel should be brought up more or less to the bottom of the tang, essentially where it was at the time of heat treating. but I let my attention slip for about half a second and the bevel crawled up another 1/16 of an inch. Now, I could have flattened the upper portion, adjusted the bevel, pretended like I meant to do it all along. But for you guys, leaving it this way, just an object lesson, something to watch out for if you try this yourself. In the grand scheme of things, it doesn't really damage the functionality of the knife, but aesthetically, it won't end up exactly where it should be according to Japanese norms. I'll start making the handle now. There are several different ways of doing this, but here's where I landed. Now I'm using alder for the main body of the handle. I cut 3 separate pieces from some scrap wood that I had on hand. Then the part that acts in effect as a sort of collar holding it all together will be made from purple heart, one of the world's hardest woods. I saw out a space in this center section that exactly fits the tang. Then I'll mill and file out a hole in the purple heart through which the tang can be inserted. It all fits together like so. Once I've got the fit all squared away, I'll glue it up using Titebond 3. Quite tricky to clamp all these pieces. I'm sure there's a better way of doing this, but anyway, it ends up working out fine after some fussing. Once the glue is cured, I trim off some excess on my bandsaw, then hand grind it into a vaguely oval profile on the belt grinder. Traditional Japanese handles don't have a lot of fancy profiling, finger grooves, and things like that. They're pretty much like hoe handles. That's hoe like my ancestors used to chop cotton with, not the other kind. Alright, smooth it out with some sandpaper. I'm going to go up to about 320 grit, but that's up to you. So once I've reached a sharp edge, I'll take the knife to my Japanese water stones for final shaping and whetting. Now, Japanese water stones, as the name implies, are kept wet during use. The swarf is washed away and used abrasives wear off rapidly, constantly exposing fresh abrasives so it doesn't clog and stop cutting well. I'll begin with what the Japanese call a binsui stone, which is equivalent to, somewhere in the neighborhood of maybe 300 grit. And once I've got a nice sharp edge, then I'll turn to a 1200 grit stone. I put a little baking soda in the water, which keeps it from causing the steel to rust. Now, Japanese water stones are made up to extremely high grits, so if you want, you can keep sharpening up to whatever grit floats your boat. There are water stones that go up to 10, 20, 30,000 grit if you have the urge to go that far. But me, I'm quitting at 1200 grit, and believe me, this is already outlandishly sharp. So finally, I'll etch the blade in a very dilute solution of ferric chloride to expose the grain of the iron. If you do this with a relatively porous material like wrought iron, make sure you neutralize it with a base. In this case, I'm using baking soda, but there are other things like TSP that you can use. Otherwise, tiny amounts of the etchant will sit inside all those tiny little crevices and just rust the crap out of your knife over time. Alright, now it's time to put on the handle. Just glob on some 2-part epoxy, then jam it in there. clean off the excess. And now a little tongue oil as a finish. Boom. And here's the final product. Imperfect, yes, but it's getting pretty close. Having done it once, I feel I could get pretty darn close next time I make one of these. Now, given that this type of knife is considered to be the apex of the Japanese knife maker's art, I feel pretty good about my first attempt. Next time, perfection. Or the time after that. So this is really one of the coolest projects that I've done in a long time. I learned a lot doing it, and I hope you guys did too. Very demanding blade to make, and really not the kind of thing that you'd want to take on for your first knife, but it's definitely something you can aspire to. And I really believe that, what keeps us in the game of knife making is that we're always looking ahead, trying to think of something, that we can improve on, some better goal to reach. Sushi knife, right up there near the top of the mountain, something we can all aspire to. If you're into Japanese swords, check out my website, waltersorrellsblades.com, where you'll see more of my work and where you'll find videos about the making of Japanese swords, along with mounting, fittings, polishing, hamones, all kinds of good stuff. Now, more videos.